The Samguk sagi, usually translated as the Histories of the Three Kingdoms, stands as the oldest surviving full-scale history of Korea. It was completed in 1145 under royal order during the Koryo period by a team of court scholars led by Kim Pusik, one of the most influential officials of his age. Written in classical Chinese, the formal written language used by the Korean court at the time, the work was arranged in a style that clearly followed the great historical models of China. It begins with the histories of Silla, Goguryeo, and Paekche set out separately in annal form, then moves into chronological tables comparing Korean reigns with those of Chinese emperors, continues with treatises on institutions and court practice, and ends with biographies of important figures. In scope, it covers nearly 1,000 years, opening with the legendary foundation of Silla and closing with that kingdom's fall in 935. Yet the value of the Samguk sagi has always been matched by a serious problem. It was written centuries after the age it describes, by the time Kim Pusik and his colleagues compiled it. Paekche and Goguryeo had been gone for hundreds of years, and even Silla had long since passed into history. This distance in time mattered. Much of the older written record had already disappeared, and the sources still available were uneven, incomplete, and often shaped by the political interests of later ages. In the case of Paekche especially, it seems that no native court history of the kingdom survived into the 12th century. The compilers had to rely on fragments, later Korean traditions, and older Chinese accounts. Some of the Korean materials they used were already filtered through the perspective of Silla or Koryo, which means that the story of Paekche often came down through the pens of those who belonged to the states that outlasted or defeated it. That limitation becomes obvious when looking at the materials Kim Pusik seems to have had in front of him. For Paekche, the surviving Korean sources available to the compilers appear to have been narrow in both number and viewpoint. Titles mentioned in the work suggest that they consulted texts such as records of the ancient Three Han, accounts of old Silla events, and the inscription from the memorial stele of Kim Yusin, the famous Silla commander who helped destroy Paekche alongside Tang forces. None of those works survives today, so the fact that some of their contents were preserved is fortunate. At the same time, they could hardly offer a balanced foundation for rebuilding the early history of a kingdom that had been conquered and written about largely by its rivals. For Goguryeo, the situation may have been slightly better, since a few older materials may still have existed. But even there, the record had clearly thinned over time. Because Korean evidence was so limited, Kim Pusik leaned heavily on Chinese histories. The Paekche narrative in particular drew from a wide range of Chinese dynastic works. Some of these texts are directly named, while others seem to have been used more quietly through paraphrase or selective borrowing. This reliance on Chinese sources gave the Samguk sagi great breadth, but it also introduced another layer of interpretation. Chinese historians had their own interests, their own political assumptions, and their own way of describing the peoples and states beyond China's borders. Early Japanese material, which might have provided another valuable perspective, does not seem to have played any clear role in the making of the text, even though such sources preserve traditions relevant to Paekche and its royal lineage. Time also changed more than just the source base. It changed the way history itself was understood. Kim Pusik was not a chronicler from the age of the Three Kingdoms. He was a 12th century official serving the Koryo court, writing in a world shaped by later political realities and by a much deeper absorption of Confucian thought than had existed in earlier centuries. The concerns of his own age naturally influenced the form and meaning of the history he produced. The Koryo court was dealing with its own tensions, internal threats, and diplomatic pressures. It also viewed the peninsula as a single political and cultural space whose history needed to be told as a long process of formation, continuity, and rule. For a court official of the Three Kingdoms period, the world would have looked very different. The state was not yet the whole peninsula in any practical sense. Loyalty was directed to a particular kingdom, and politics revolved around survival, rivalry, and expansion within a fractured landscape. Foreign relations also looked different depending on the age. In Kim Pusik's world, the Korean court had long experience dealing with powerful northern states that were not Chinese, while maintaining culturally prestigious ties with Song China. That setting encouraged a view of China as the center of civilized order, even when real power on the frontier sometimes belonged to other peoples. For the rulers and officials of the Three Kingdoms era, however, the balance of danger was not the same. Their main rivals were usually other Korean states, and Chinese military power mattered most at certain decisive moments, rather than as a constant pressure. This is especially important because the eventual unification of much of the peninsula under Silla was achieved in part through Chinese military intervention. A historian writing centuries later, steeped in Confucian court culture, would inevitably judge such events through assumptions that differed sharply from those of the people who actually lived through them. Kim Pusik's own beliefs left a clear mark on the text. He was a committed Confucian official who believed in royal authority, centralized administration, and the moral function of history. For him, the past was not merely a sequence of events. It was a source of instruction. History was meant to teach rulers and ministers how states rise, how they fail, and how proper conduct preserves order. This purpose appears openly in the work. In certain places, Kim interrupts the narrative with formal commentaries in which he judges rulers and officials according to moral and political principles. These passages are especially revealing because the annal style itself is usually very sparse. Most entries in the work are brief and factual in appearance, but the commentaries expose the compiler's deeper concerns. In the Paekche section, these judgments often focus on good kingship, loyalty, proper conduct at court, and the reasons dynasties lose their strength. The fall of a kingdom becomes, in that framework, not only a political event, but also a moral lesson. For that reason, the Samguk sagi is both indispensable and difficult. It is the single most important surviving source for early Korean history. Yet, it is also a text shaped at every stage by selection, loss, interpretation, and later ideology. It preserves material that would otherwise have vanished entirely, but it does not give an untouched window into the past. What it shows is the ancient history of the peninsula as remembered, organized, and judged by historians writing much later, under royal command. Its weaknesses are real, but so is its value. It tells us not only about early Korea, but also about the world of the Koryo elite, who chose to preserve that past in a particular form. The greatest problem in its presentation of early history appears in its dating of the foundations of Silla and Paekche. In both cases, the dates are almost certainly too early. This was probably not something invented by Kim Pusik himself. Rather, he seems to have inherited already established traditions that push these origins back into a remote and prestigious past. Silla, which ultimately unified the peninsula and ruled it for generations, had every reason to claim the earliest and most honourable beginning among the three kingdoms. Assigning its foundation to an especially auspicious year would have strengthened both royal prestige and historical legitimacy. The date attached to Silla appears to have been chosen not by accident, but because it carried symbolic value within the traditional East Asian cyclical calendar. Koguryo's founding date played an important role in this system. Earlier traditions already placed its beginning in the final decades before the Common Era. Some evidence outside the Samguk sagi also points to an early belief that Koguryo had endured for roughly 7 centuries before its destruction. That memory seems to have influenced the date later fixed in Korean historical writing. Once Koguryo's beginning was placed in that period, the date assigned to Silla could be arranged to fall in the opening year of the same sexagenary cycle, giving it both symbolic priority and chronological elegance. The result was a neat historical structure, but not necessarily a reliable one. In the case of Paekche, the same logic appears to have worked again, with its founding date set in relation to Koguryo's chronology. Unlike Koguryo, however, Paekche's early date does not find support in contemporary Chinese records. That does not mean the idea was first created in the 12th century. Japanese texts from later centuries already preserve chronologies that treat Paekche as far older than the external evidence allows. This suggests that an inflated timeline for the dynasty had been circulating on the peninsula long before Kim Pusik wrote. Once such a chronology was accepted, historians faced a major problem. Paekche's own records seem not to have begun until much later, and Silla's earliest known historical writing also appears centuries after the dates claimed for its beginning. That left a huge empty span that had to be filled somehow. Not surprisingly, the earliest portions of the annals are crowded with legends, omens, miraculous elements, and stories that cannot be verified historically. The Paekche annals open with several different foundation stories, and this in itself is revealing. The text does not preserve a single simple tradition. It presents competing narratives, though it clearly favours one above the others. In the preferred account, Onjo is treated as the true founder of the dynasty. He is said to have been of royal Puyo descent and born in a branch realm, connected with the wider world of Puyo in the north. This ancestry mattered deeply because the royal house of Paekche claimed Puyo as its family name and used that connection to assert prestige. Puyo itself appears in Chinese sources as an important kingdom of southern Manchuria, known over many centuries and remembered as a people with close ties to the Chinese world. According to the favoured story, Onjo was the son of Chumong, the heroic founder of Koguryo. Chumong was portrayed not simply as a ruler, but as a figure of extraordinary birth and destiny. In Korean tradition, he later came to be linked with the title Tongmyong, meaning a luminous ruler of the East. That same name appears in earlier Chinese writing as the legendary founder of Puyo, whose miraculous story closely resembles the tales later told about Chumong. This suggests that old northern myths were adapted and reused to glorify both Koguryo and the Paekche royal house that claimed descent from it. In that sense, the story was doing more than explaining origins. It was building an aura of sacred ancestry. The narrative continues with Chumong leaving his homeland, reaching a new domain in the region later associated with Koguryo, marrying into the local ruling family and rising to the throne. Onjo and his brother Piryu are then presented as sons, born after this new kingdom had already been established. At first they seem secure, but everything changes with the sudden arrival of Yuri, an older son from Chumong's earlier life. Once Yuri is acknowledged as heir, Onjo and Piryu see that their future in Koguryo has narrowed. They lead a group of followers southward, choose separate places to settle in the Han River region, and eventually only Onjo's settlement prospers. From that successful base, Paekche is said to have grown. This story creates a very tight chronology. If Koguryo began in the late 1st century, before the Common Era, and Onjo was born only afterward, then he must have founded Paekche while still very young. The time between Koguryo's beginning, Yuri's arrival, and the establishment of Onjo's new realm is strikingly short. The sequence works as legend, but as history, it raises obvious doubts. it feels less like the record of remembered events and more like a constructed genealogy designed to tie Paekche closely to Koguryo while still preserving its separate royal identity. The text also preserves a second version of the story, and this one shifts the emphasis in an important way. In that account, Onjo and Piryu are not sons of Chumong by birth, but sons of another man, with their mother later becoming Chumong's consort after his rise to power. Much of the plot remains similar, including the arrival of an older son and the movement southward, but here Piryu takes the lead and becomes the true founder. The existence of this alternative tradition shows that early memories of Paekche's beginnings were neither fixed nor uniform. Different groups may have preserved different ancestral claims, and later, historians tried to fit them together rather than erase all but one. A third foundation story survives in Chinese histories and differs even more sharply. In that version, Paekche is founded not by Onjo or Piryu, but by a descendant of the Puyo royal line named Kutai. This account still places the dynasty's roots in northern ancestry, but it ties the foundation to a much later historical setting, around the end of the 2nd century or beginning of the 3rd century. That timing fits far better with what can be gathered from Chinese evidence about political developments in the peninsula. Yet the story also contains its own problems, and some of its details do not align cleanly with other early records. Even so, it remains extremely important because it is the earliest surviving account of Paekche's origins, and was written when the kingdom still existed and maintained active contact with China. These Chinese materials are especially striking because they describe not only the founder, but also the royal ancestral cult centered on him. They report that Paekche kings honored this dynastic ancestor regularly, at a shrine inside the palace grounds. They also preserve the claim that the ruling house descended from the same broader Puyo tradition associated with Tongmyong. This means that although the Chinese version disagrees with later Korean tradition about exact chronology and specific narrative details, it still confirms a central point. Paekche's rulers defined themselves as outsiders to the southern lands they ruled, men of northern royal descent whose authority rested in part on that foreign and prestigious origin. Japanese sources offer still another angle. Though brief, they preserve traditions that often align more closely with the Korean legends than with the Chinese account. This is not surprising, since many noble families in early Japan traced their origins back to immigrants from the Korean Peninsula, especially from Paekche. In those records, the forefather of the Paekche royal line appears under a form of the name that corresponds to Chumong. He is described as a remarkable figure who fled from Puyo and established kingship over peoples of the peninsula. These texts also preserve genealogical calculations that place later Paekche kings many generations after that founder, which suggests that the idea of a very ancient dynasty was already widespread, long before the Samguk sagi was compiled. Even so, those Japanese materials do not solve the historical problem. Their king counts and generational distances do not always agree with one another, and some clearly preserve different chronological schemes. Yet several of them come surprisingly close to the expanded royal line found in the Korean tradition. This suggests that the long and probably artificial Paekche king list was not a late invention of one historian. It had deeper roots. By the early 9th century, it was already circulating in more than one form beyond Korea itself. That does not make it accurate, but it does show how early the inflated memory of Paekche's antiquity had become established. Across Korean, Chinese, and Japanese traditions, one point remains constant. Paekche's rulers were remembered as descendants of northern Puyo stock, rather than natives of the southwestern peninsula. That claim appears again and again, It appears in diplomatic statements, in royal naming practices, in stories of origin, and even in later attempts by Paekche rulers to rename their kingdom in a way that openly emphasized their Puyo connection. The prestige of that ancestry was not symbolic decoration alone. It was central to royal identity. Whether the story was told through Chumong, through Kut'ai, or through other variants, the message remained the same. The dynasty derived its authority from a noble lineage that came from beyond the southern lands it ruled. When the legendary material is set aside and the external evidence is brought back into view, a more cautious picture emerges. Chinese histories describing southern Korea in the late 3rd century do not yet present Paekche as a mature kingdom of the type imagined in later narrative. Instead, they describe the south as a landscape of many small polities grouped into larger confederations. Among them appears a state whose name resembles an early form of Paekche, but it is only one among many communities. It is not yet singled out as a major centralized monarchy. This suggests that whatever later became the Kingdom of Paekche likely began as one regional polity among several, and rose gradually, rather than suddenly, through the dramatic acts of a single founder in the late 1st century before the Common Era. That is why the Samguk sagi remains so fascinating. It preserves memory, identity, and ideology all at once. It gives the later shape of Korea's ancient past. But beneath that shape lie traces of lost records, political myth-making, regional competition, and centuries of reinterpretation. Its account of Paekche's beginnings cannot be read at face value, yet it cannot be ignored. It is both a historical source and an artifact of historical imagination. In its pages, the early Korean past survives not as a clear photograph, but as a layered reconstruction shaped by kings, scholars, and traditions that each left their mark on what later generations came to remember. Chinese historical records offer some of the clearest clues for understanding how the small Mahan state, known as Paekche-guk, eventually transformed into the Kingdom of Paekche. These sources outline a relatively narrow window of time during which that transition must have taken place. Their testimony also exposes major problems in the chronology presented in later Korean tradition, which claims that Paekche was founded as early as the 1st century before the Common Era, and that it quickly conquered the entire territory of the Mahan Confederation. Evidence from Chinese records suggests something very different. Instead of a sudden appearance in the distant past, Paekche seems to have emerged gradually from within the Mahan political landscape sometime between the late 3rd and the late 4th century. The earliest Chinese reference to the Mahan Confederation appears in a report describing an attack in the early 2nd century against a Chinese stronghold far to the north. The geographical details of that record are somewhat uncertain, yet it clearly demonstrates that the Mahan were already known to Chinese observers by that time. Later sources continue to mention the Confederation, and one record from the end of the 3rd century describes Mahan representatives presenting tribute to a Chinese court through official channels on the peninsula. After that moment, the Confederation fades from the record. In contrast, the Kingdom of Paekche begins to appear clearly in Chinese diplomatic reports during the 4th century. One particularly important account describes an embassy sent from Paekche to a Chinese court in the year 372. The ruler of Paekche offered tribute and was formally acknowledged as a king. He was also granted honorary titles within the Chinese diplomatic system, recognition that indicates Paekche had already become a state of significant standing. Additional evidence from the same period reveals that Paekche was no longer a minor community. During the 3rd quarter of the 4th century, it appears as a formidable military power. In one well-known event, a Koguryo king was killed during a battle against Paekche forces near Pyongyang. This moment shows that Paekches had already developed the political organization and military strength necessary to challenge one of the major northern states. By that time, it was clearly more than a small member of the old Mahan Confederation. Chinese histories also describe the broader environment in which Paekche emerged. For centuries, the northern part of the Korean Peninsula had been dominated by Chinese commanderies established during the Han period. These colonial administrations controlled large areas and served as centers of Chinese authority, trade, and culture. One of the most important of these commanderies was Lolang, which operated for several centuries with its administrative center near modern Pyongyang. Another commandery called Taifang was established later to reinforce Chinese influence in the southern part of the region. Taifang lay closer to the Han River basin, the very area where Paekche would eventually rise. Taifang was created in response to repeated attacks from local communities living south of Lolang. Chinese authorities reorganized their administration in order to strengthen control and stabilize the frontier. Archaeological discoveries suggest that Taifang's administrative center stood in what is now Huanghai province. From there, Chinese officials supervised relations with surrounding populations and received tribute missions from neighboring groups, including the Mahan Confederation. As long as these commanderies remained strong, they stood as powerful barriers between the emerging Korean polities of the south and the northern kingdom of Koguryo. For a long time, historians believed that these commanderies disappeared early in the 4th century. According to that view, Koguryo conquered Lolang and quickly absorbed the surrounding territories, while Paekche expanded northward at roughly the same time. Yet archaeological evidence complicates this picture. In several regions of the former commandery territory, tomb inscriptions and other artifacts show that Chinese families remained wealthy and influential well into the middle of the 4th century. Some members of the Chinese elite even continue to hold positions of authority. This suggests that the decline of Chinese control happened gradually rather than suddenly. Even at the beginning of the 4th century, there is little sign that Paekche existed as a powerful kingdom near the borders of the Chinese commanderies. Chinese emperors still used Taifang as a place of exile for troublesome princes, which indicates that the region remained securely under imperial influence. If Paekche had already been a strong neighbouring state, Chinese officials would almost certainly have mentioned it more frequently. Instead, the historical record suggests that Paekche only rose to prominence sometime between the final references to Mahan in the late 3rd century and the appearance of Paekche embassies in the 4th century. The simplest explanation is that one of the Mahan communities gradually expanded its authority over the others and transformed itself into a centralized kingdom. Yet this explanation alone cannot fully account for an important detail repeated in many historical traditions. The royal house of Paekche consistently claimed that it descended from northern Puyo aristocracy rather than from the local population of the Han River basin. This claim appears in diplomatic correspondence, in historical narratives, and even in the official name adopted by Paekche rulers at certain moments. The persistence of this tradition suggests that it carried at least some historical truth. If members of the Puyo elite truly migrated south and established themselves among the Mahan communities, it raises the question of why they would have left their homeland. Such a movement would likely have been caused by political upheaval, rather than by peaceful exploration. Chinese records describe 2 devastating attacks against the Puyo state during the late 3rd and mid-4th centuries. In both cases, mounted warriors from the Murong branch of the Xianbei people invaded the Puyo capital and carried away thousands of captives. The earlier of these invasions occurred in the year 285 and caused widespread disruption within the Puyo realm. After that attack, some members of the royal family and their followers fled southward. Chinese records state that these refugees first moved into the territory of coastal tribal groups. From there, it is possible that they continued their migration along the peninsula and eventually reached the Han River region. Some historians have proposed that these displaced aristocrats later became the ruling elite of Paekche. If this interpretation is correct, the kingdom's northern origin story would reflect a genuine historical memory, preserved within later legend. Yet another tradition complicates the picture. Korean and Japanese sources repeatedly state that the Paekche royal line descended from the founders of Goguryeo. In these accounts, the ancestry of Paekche kings runs through the legendary hero Chumong, who established the northern kingdom. If this tradition contains historical truth, then the founders of Paekche may have been members of the Goguryeo royal lineage, rather than refugees directly from Puyo. This possibility directs attention to the turbulent political struggles that shook Goguryeo during the late 3rd century. According to historical records, the royal court of Goguryeo was plagued by violent rivalries during that period. Princes were executed, rivals were eliminated, and succession disputes often ended in bloodshed. One particularly brutal reign saw the execution of close relatives and the attempted assassination of rival heirs. Such instability created strong incentives for members of the royal family to escape the court before they became the next targets of intrigue. A prince who feared for his life could easily gather supporters and flee southward in search of safety. Several moments during this era stand out as possible turning points. One occurred during the reign of a ruler who systematically eliminated potential rivals to the throne. Another came immediately after his assassination, when the balance of power at court shifted and the supporters of the former king suddenly faced retaliation. A third possibility arises during the early years of the new king, who restored stability to the kingdom. Even during a more peaceful reign, defeated factions might have chosen exile rather than risk continued political marginalization. Among these possibilities, the aftermath of the royal assassination appears particularly compelling. In that moment, loyalists of the fallen king would have had strong reasons to flee before the new regime consolidated power. Such a migration could have carried members of the royal lineage southward, where they might have carved out authority among the fragmented communities of the Mahan Confederation. Over time, those communities could have been unified under the leadership of the newcomers, giving birth to a new state. Chinese historical texts describe the growth of Paekche in terms that fit this scenario remarkably well. They state that the kingdom originally began as one among many Mahan communities. Gradually, under the leadership of rulers with northern ancestry, it extended its influence and absorbed neighbouring polities. As this process continued, the confederation structure dissolved, and Paekche emerged as a dominant regional power. By the early 4th century, the old Mahan and Chinhan confederations still existed, but during the following decades, the political balance shifted. Paekche and Goguryeo rose to prominence, eventually replacing the earlier confederations as the main powers of the peninsula. The Korean historical tradition tells the same story in a more detailed narrative form, although its chronology places these events far earlier than the external evidence allows. In that narrative, the founder of Paekche first settles among the Mahan and initially depends on their protection. Later, he gradually expands his authority and finally conquers the entire confederation. While the dates attached to these episodes are clearly unrealistic, the general sequence of events may still reflect authentic memories of how the kingdom developed. This interpretation also explains why early Paekche rulers appear to have cooperated with the Mahan leadership before eventually dominating them. Newly arrived migrants from the north would not have possessed an immediate military advantage. At first, they would have needed allies, resources, and time to establish themselves. The Mahan leaders may even have welcomed them as useful defenders of the northern frontier. Once the newcomers consolidated their own power base, however, the relationship could have shifted from cooperation to rivalry and eventually to conquest. Despite these insights, the exact date when Paekche first emerged as a kingdom remains uncertain. Written records and archaeological discoveries still leave many questions unanswered. At present, the safest conclusion is that the royal state of Paekche formed sometime between the final decades of the 3rd century and the later decades of the 4th. Future excavations may refine this timeline further, especially since archaeologists have already identified the location of the kingdom's earliest long-term capital. According to historical tradition, the first Paekche ruler established his settlement at a place called Uija. After a short time, the capital moved to a new location south of the Han River near a mountain known as Han. From this setting, the city became widely known as Han Song, the walled city of the Han region. For many years, scholars debated the precise location of this early capital, but excavations conducted in modern Seoul have revealed extensive remains along the southeastern bank of the Han River. Defensive walls, residential areas, and elite tombs indicate that this site served as the heart of the early Paekche state. The early kings described in the traditional history present another challenge for historians. Official records were apparently not kept in Paekche until the reign of King Geunchogo during the late 4th century. Yet the historical narrative places the founding of the kingdom centuries earlier. This gap created a major problem for later historians, who attempted to construct a continuous royal chronicle. To fill the empty centuries, they relied on legends, genealogies, and speculation. One result of this effort is the extraordinary length attributed to the reigns of Paekche's earliest kings. Many of them are said to have ruled for more than 30 years, far longer than the typical reigns recorded after the historical record becomes reliable. When their lifespans are estimated, based on the genealogical information provided in the text, the results become even more improbable. Several kings would have lived well beyond a century, and some calculations suggest lifespans that stretch far beyond normal human limits. These figures clearly reveal that the early portion of the royal list was constructed long after the events it claims to describe. Even small details within the chronicle expose similar problems. The recorded months of death for early Paekche rulers are heavily concentrated in the final months of the year. This pattern suggests that later, editors simply chose a likely season for death, when the real date was unknown. In contrast, the death dates recorded for early Silla rulers are distributed more evenly throughout the year, which indicates the historians had access to somewhat fuller records for that kingdom. The early narrative also describes Paekche's relations with neighbouring powers. Many entries mention conflicts with Chinese commanderies, raids by tribal groups from the north, and occasional encounters with Goguryeo and Silla. Some of these stories may preserve fragments of genuine historical memory, even though the chronology is clearly distorted. The portrayal of early hostility between Paekche and the Chinese commanderies is especially plausible, since a rising regional state would inevitably have clashed with the remnants of colonial administration. Another recurring enemy in the narrative is a group called the Malgal. They are depicted as mobile raiders who repeatedly attacked Paekche's northern borders. However, the term itself appears to be an anachronism introduced by later historians. Earlier Chinese records refer instead to tribal populations known collectively as the Ye, whose territory extended along the eastern side of the peninsula. It is likely that the chroniclers used the later name Malgal when referring to these earlier groups. Interactions with Goguryeo appear surprisingly rarely in the early narrative. In reality, the two states were separated by considerable distance and by the territory controlled by Chinese commanderies. Only after those commanderies declined would regular contact between the kingdoms have become possible. The limited number of early references to Goguryeo therefore reflects the actual geopolitical situation fairly well, even though the specific episodes themselves may be unreliable. Relations with Silla, however, appear far more frequently. The chronicle includes dozens of entries describing encounters between the two southern states, long before either had truly emerged as a major power. Many of these passages appear to have been borrowed directly from Silla historical traditions and adapted to fit the Paekche narrative. Their vivid detail suggests that they may reflect real conflicts that occurred later in history but were placed earlier in the timeline to fill the chronological gap created by the exaggerated founding dates. The final piece of evidence revealing the kingdom's development concerns its political organization. According to the traditional record, a complex bureaucratic system was already established during the 3rd century. The text describes 6 major ministerial offices and a hierarchy of 16 official ranks distinguished by different colours of court robes. Yet this claim conflicts with earlier Chinese evidence showing that Paekche did not even exist as a centralised state at that time. More reliable sources suggest that this administrative system took shape much later. Chinese and Japanese records from the 6th century mention officials holding some of these ranks, indicating that the system was certainly in operation by that time. It may have developed gradually as Paekche expanded and required more sophisticated forms of governance. Some elements of the system may have been inspired by Chinese administrative models, particularly the tradition of dividing central authority among a small number of high ministers, responsible for major state functions. The question of when the 6 ministerial offices of Paekche were actually created remains unresolved. Some historical traditions place their establishment in the 3rd century, but this date cannot be sustained when compared with other surviving evidence. Later sources hint that the system may have appeared much later, possibly toward the end of the kingdom's existence. The problem lies in the fact that the surviving records provide conflicting signals. Mentions of these ministerial positions appear in narratives describing earlier centuries. Yet, the descriptions of the offices themselves seem to rely on information preserved in much later historical writings. Another difficulty arises from the pattern of references to these offices. After the beginning of the 6th century, the record suddenly becomes silent regarding the ministers, despite continuing to discuss other elements of government. At the same time, historians who compiled later accounts of Paekche appear to have relied on sources produced centuries after the kingdom's fall when describing the titles and responsibilities of these officials. Because of these contradictions, it is impossible to determine with certainty whether the ministerial system was introduced early in Paekche's development, or whether it emerged much later as part of administrative reforms. The only conclusion that can be stated with confidence is that the extremely early date sometimes given for the creation of these offices cannot be correct. Whether the ministers were established relatively early or only toward the end of the kingdom's history, the evidence suggests that they existed alongside another group of powerful officials known as the councillors. Among these councillors, the figure known as the senior councillor appears to have held particularly high authority. Although surviving records do not describe the exact institutional relationship between the councillors and the ministers. The structure implied by the texts suggests a hierarchy similar to systems found in other East Asian governments. In this arrangement, the councillors appear to have occupied the highest positions within the royal administration. Their role would have been to advise the king and help shape major policy decisions. The ministers, although influential in their own right, were more likely responsible for carrying out these decisions within their respective areas of responsibility. In practice, this would have meant that each ministry oversaw a particular sphere of state activity, translating royal policy into concrete administrative action. The official ranking system of Paekche provides further insight into how the government operated. 16 formal ranks existed within the bureaucracy, forming a hierarchical structure that indicated status within the court. These titles were primarily marks of prestige rather than strictly defined job descriptions. Nevertheless, rank clearly influenced the type of responsibilities an individual could hold. Military commanders, court officials, religious figures, and envoys could all possess official rank titles that reflected their standing in the political order. Some of the highest ranks appear frequently in connection with military leadership. Individuals bearing certain senior titles often commanded armies or supervised defensive operations. Other ranks appear in more specialized contexts. Practitioners of medicine, interpreters of omens, and diplomatic envoys are recorded with mid-level rank titles that place them lower in the formal hierarchy but still within the recognized structure of the state. Royal favor could also influence the distribution of rank. On one occasion, a king reportedly granted the highest rank to dozens of his own sons born to secondary wives. Such acts demonstrate that the rank system did not simply reflect administrative necessity, but also served as a tool of royal patronage and political reward. Descriptions of the ministers themselves suggest that their responsibilities corresponded broadly to the titles they held. The official responsible for military affairs appears overseeing the construction of defensive fortifications, while the official connected with ritual matters appears leading diplomatic missions abroad. These details support the idea that the ministerial system, whenever it was created, was designed to divide the central administration into clearly defined spheres of authority. Political power within Paekche was closely tied to lineage and family background. Membership in the royal house or in one of the leading aristocratic clans was the most important qualification for influence. Chinese observers recorded the names of several powerful families who dominated the upper levels of Paekche society. Although the number of such families was small, they controlled a large share of the kingdom's wealth, land, and political authority. Among these noble houses, a few stand out as particularly prominent. Members of certain clans frequently married into the royal family, supplying queens and strengthening alliances with the throne. Other clans produced influential officials who served as ministers or senior advisors. The repeated appearance of the same family names in positions of authority reveals how concentrated political power was within a narrow elite. Above these aristocratic families stood the royal house itself. The ruling dynasty claimed descent from northern ancestors and adopted a surname that reflected this prestigious lineage. Members of the royal clan often occupied the most powerful positions in government, though the heir to the throne was typically excluded from routine administrative office in order to preserve his unique status. Most historical narratives concerning Paekche focus on events at the royal court, leaving everyday life in the countryside largely unexplored. The internal administrative geography of the kingdom also remains somewhat obscure. Nevertheless, scattered references indicate that the state divided its territory into several large administrative regions. These divisions appear to have been organized broadly according to the four directions of the compass, creating a structure that helped the central government supervise distant areas. This system of regional organization resembles administrative practices known from neighboring states and from Chinese models. The concept of dividing a country into major territorial circuits had already appeared in earlier political systems across East Asia. It seems likely that Paekche adopted and adapted this approach as it developed a more complex structure of governance. Little information survives concerning how these regional divisions were governed in practice. The sources rarely describe local officials or the mechanisms used to administer rural communities. What does appear clearly is that the capital remained the focal point of political life. Major decisions, ceremonies, and administrative appointments all revolved around the royal court. Religion in Paekche, before the arrival of Buddhism, is also difficult to reconstruct. Surviving evidence suggests that two broad forms of religious practice existed, side by side. One level of belief was closely tied to everyday life in an agricultural society. These practices concerned fertility, weather, illness, and the spirits believed to inhabit the natural world. Another level of religious activity was connected with political authority and royal ritual. The most detailed descriptions of early religious customs come not from Paekche itself, but from accounts of the Mahan communities that once inhabited the same region. These descriptions portray a society that believed strongly in spirits and supernatural forces. Ritual specialists presided over sacrifices dedicated to these powers, performing ceremonies intended to ensure prosperity and protection. In each community, sacred areas were set aside where important rituals took place. Tall wooden poles decorated with bells and drums marked these spaces, creating a distinctive environment for ceremonies. These sacred zones also functioned as places of refuge. Individuals who reached them were protected by religious taboo, even if they were criminals or fugitives. Agricultural festivals played a major role in communal life. Two major celebrations occurred each year, marking the beginning of planting and the completion of the harvest. These gatherings combined ritual offerings with public festivities in which people sang, danced, and drank together. Burial customs also reflected religious belief. The dead were sometimes accompanied by offerings of animals, suggesting a belief that life continued in another realm, beyond death. Although these practices belonged to the earlier Mahan communities, elements of them likely persisted within Paekche society. Some aspects may also have merged with traditions brought by the ruling elite from the northern regions. Shamanistic beliefs were widespread across Northeast Asia during this period, and it is reasonable to assume that similar traditions existed within Paekche as well. Occasionally, the historical record preserves curious stories that hint at these older beliefs. Some narratives describe strange transformations or unusual encounters with animals such as tigers. These episodes often appear in connection with the death of important figures or the outbreak of disaster, suggesting that they were interpreted as supernatural warnings. Such motifs are strongly associated with later shamanistic traditions of the Korean Peninsula. Other passages describe the presence of individuals who interpreted signs and predicted the future. Some of these figures resemble diviners known from Chinese culture, while others may represent local religious specialists, closer to shamans. The distinction between these roles is not always clear, especially since later historians may have reshaped earlier traditions to fit the cultural expectations of their own time. Royal religion in Paekche followed a more formal pattern influenced by the broader traditions of East Asian court culture. One of the most important rituals involved honouring the legendary ancestor of the royal dynasty. The first act, attributed to the kingdom's founding ruler, was the establishment of a shrine dedicated to this ancestral figure. Through ceremonies held at this shrine, the royal house reaffirmed its sacred lineage and legitimized its authority. The identity of the ancestor, honoured in this cult, traces back to the heroic founder associated with northern traditions. According to legend, he possessed extraordinary abilities and divine favour, making him an ideal progenitor for a ruling dynasty. Royal visits to the ancestral shrine are recorded repeatedly, indicating that the cult remained an important element of state ideology. Chinese observers also reported that Paekche kings conducted regular sacrifices to heaven and earth. In Chinese tradition, such rituals were performed only by the emperor, symbolizing supreme authority over the realm. By adopting similar ceremonies, Paekche rulers asserted their own sovereignty, while simultaneously demonstrating their familiarity with the prestigious cultural models of the Chinese world. Belief in omens also played a significant role in the worldview of the court. Unusual natural events were carefully recorded because they were thought to reveal the hidden intentions of heaven. Solar eclipses, comets, and strange alignments of the planets were all regarded as signals that the balance between heaven and the human world had been disturbed. Many of the celestial events recorded in Paekche's historical tradition appear to have been borrowed directly from Chinese astronomical records. Modern calculations show that numerous eclipses described in the narrative could not have been observed from the Korean Peninsula at all. Some would have been visible only in distant regions of the world, while others occurred on dates when no eclipse happened anywhere. These inconsistencies strongly suggest that the entries were copied from foreign sources rather than recorded through local observation. Natural disasters also appear frequently in the record. Droughts, earthquakes, floods, violent storms, and swarms of locusts are all described as ominous signs. Such events were interpreted as warnings that the ruler had lost the favour of heaven or that disorder threatened the stability of the state. Interestingly, most of these disasters are mentioned only in connection with Paekche and rarely appear in accounts of neighbouring kingdoms during the same years. This pattern indicates that many of these entries were probably inserted to create a more complete historical narrative, rather than to document actual events. The placement of these ominous signs within the narrative also reveals how historians shaped their stories. Long reigns required a steady flow of recorded events, and celestial or natural omens provided convenient material. In accounts of the earliest rulers, such signs occupy a large portion of the narrative, helping fill gaps created by the lack of reliable historical information. In later centuries, the distribution of omens changes. Instead of appearing evenly across all reigns, they cluster around rulers whose reputations were controversial or whose reigns ended in tragedy. A king known for indulgence and poor judgment is surrounded by warnings from heaven that seem to foreshadow his violent death. Another ruler, whose reign ended with the destruction of the kingdom, is likewise accompanied by a series of ominous signs that appear to predict the fall of the state itself. From a critical historical perspective, the story of Paekche becomes reliably visible only in the later 4th century. Earlier traditions describe events stretching far back into antiquity, yet firm confirmation from outside sources appears only during this later period. Chinese and Japanese records begin to mention Paekche independently around the same time that the kingdom itself is said to have started keeping official written records. This coincidence marks an important turning point. It does not necessarily mean that the kingdom itself was founded at that moment. Rather, it indicates that Paekche had already developed into a stable and organized state, capable of diplomacy, record-keeping, and participation in international affairs. The ruler most closely associated with this transition was King Geunchogo, whose reign lasted roughly 3 decades in the mid-4th century. During his rule, Paekche emerged clearly into the historical record. Diplomatic missions were sent abroad, formal relations were established with powerful neighbours, and military campaigns demonstrated the strength of the kingdom. One of the most dramatic events of this period was a campaign that reached the city of Pyongyang and resulted in the death of the king of Goguryeo in battle. With Geunchogo's reign, the sparse and uncertain early traditions about Paekche begin to merge with information preserved in foreign records and supported by archaeological evidence. Because the available material becomes more detailed from this point onward, a simple chronological narration is not always the best way to understand Paekche's development. Events on the Korean Peninsula were closely connected with developments beyond it. Military conflicts, diplomacy, cultural change, and internal political evolution constantly influenced one another. The kingdom's relationship with distant courts affected its balance of power with neighbouring states, and cultural influences from abroad reshaped the character of its ruling elite. To understand this complex history, it is helpful to look at several major themes that shaped Paekche's experience. These include its relations with Japan and China, its interactions with neighbouring kingdoms on the peninsula, and the internal political and cultural transformations that defined its society. Contact with the Japanese archipelago formed one of the most important external relationships in Paekche's history. Although Paekche's own historical narratives say little about early connections with Japan during Geunchogo's reign, Japanese sources describe an active diplomatic relationship already taking shape in the late 4th century. This silence in Korean records likely reflects the perspective of the historians who later compiled them. These writers lived centuries after the events they described, at a time when Japan was remembered mainly as a hostile maritime power. Their experience naturally shaped the tone of their work, making them less inclined to emphasize periods of cooperation between Paekche and the rulers of the archipelago. Yet the broader historical context suggests that the relationship between Paekche and the Japanese leadership was often close and mutually beneficial. Trade and travel across the narrow seas separating Korea and Japan had existed for centuries. Communities on both sides of the straits were familiar with one another, and valuable goods moved regularly between them. Iron was especially important. Early Japanese societies lacked sufficient sources of high-quality iron and relied heavily on supplies from southern Korea. Weapons, armor, and tools produced by Korean craftsmen were highly prized in the archipelago, making the region around the Naktong River an area of intense economic interest. Political developments in Japan during the 4th century transformed these contacts. Earlier, Chinese accounts described the archipelago as divided into many small polities. Over time, however, a more centralized authority emerged, led by rulers based in the Yamato region. This leadership gradually extended influence across much of western and central Japan. As the Yamato court consolidated its power, it also sought stronger ties with the Korean Peninsula. Japanese historical tradition preserves an account in which Paekche initiated diplomatic contact with the Yamato court during the late 4th century. According to this narrative, envoys from both Paekche and Silla visited the Japanese court, though tensions between the two Korean kingdoms soon disrupted the mission. The story continues with a joint military expedition launched by Yamato forces alongside Paekche against Silla. Whether every detail of this narrative is accurate remains uncertain, but it reflects a broader reality. Paekche and the Yamato leadership found it useful to cooperate during this period. Material evidence from Japan appears to support the existence of this alliance. Among the treasured objects preserved in a Japanese shrine is an unusual ceremonial sword with 7 branching blades. Its inscription suggests that it was presented by the king of Paekche and his crown prince to the ruler of the archipelago. Although parts of the text are damaged and the interpretation of its wording remains debated, Many scholars connect the object with diplomatic exchanges of the late 4th century. The gift of such a weapon would have symbolized friendship and mutual respect between the two courts. The relationship between Paekche and the Yamato leadership continued to evolve during the following decades. Evidence indicates that Japanese influence was particularly strong in southern Korea, especially in the region historically known as Kaya. This area consisted of a cluster of small states, occupying the fertile basin of the Naktong River. These polities played a major role in regional trade and controlled access to valuable iron resources. Japanese sources often describe the rulers of these states as subordinate to the Yamato court. While Korean accounts portray them as independent powers, the reality was likely more complex, with varying degrees of cooperation, alliance, and competition depending on local circumstances. At times, the Yamato court appears to have exercised considerable influence in this region. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that Japanese forces operated on the peninsula during the late 4th and early 5th centuries. Some inscriptions and historical narratives refer to military campaigns and shifting alliances among the kingdoms of Korea and the leaders of the archipelago. These developments formed part of a larger struggle for influence in Northeast Asia. While Paekche cultivated ties with Japan, it also developed diplomatic relations with China. Compared with the complicated evidence surrounding Japanese connections, the record of Paekche's contact with Chinese dynasties is clearer. Chinese historical works often noted the arrival of foreign embassies and carefully recorded the titles granted to visiting rulers. Because Paekche's own chronicles relied heavily on these Chinese accounts, much of the surviving information about the relationship between the two countries comes from Chinese sources themselves. During the period when China was divided into rival northern and southern regimes, Paekche maintained closer contact with the dynasties ruling in the south. Geography likely played an important role in this preference. The northern route to China required passing through territory controlled by Goguryeo, a powerful rival. Sailing directly across the Yellow Sea to the southern Chinese coast was often safer and more practical. Cultural considerations may also have influenced this policy. The southern dynasties represented the continuation of traditional Chinese court culture, and their prestige carried great weight across East Asia. Paekche's first confirmed embassy to China arrived at the court of the Eastern Jin dynasty in the early 370s. Chinese records describe the reception of this mission and note that the Paekche ruler received several honorary titles. Such exchanges formed the basis of diplomatic relations throughout the following centuries. The titles bestowed by Chinese emperors reinforced the authority of Paekche's kings at home, while the Chinese court benefited from the symbolic recognition of its prestige by distant lands. These titles were largely ceremonial during this era. Chinese rulers had little ability to enforce their authority over distant kingdoms. Yet the political symbolism remained important. A Paekche king who received recognition from the Chinese emperor could claim a connection with the most prestigious civilization of East Asia. At the same time, Chinese rulers could point to foreign envoys arriving at their court as evidence of the universal influence of their empire. In some cases, the granting of titles also reflected subtle political maneuvering. Japanese rulers likewise sent embassies to China and requested official recognition of their authority over various regions, including territories on the Korean Peninsula. Chinese emperors occasionally acknowledged some of these claims, but carefully avoided endorsing Japanese authority over Paekche itself. By maintaining Paekche's separate status, the Chinese court helped reinforce the kingdom's independence within the regional balance of power. Military conflict remained a constant feature of Paekche's history during this period, particularly in its relationship with Goguryeo. The earliest clearly documented clash between the two kingdoms occurred in the late 4th century, when Koguryo launched a major invasion of Paekche territory. According to historical accounts, the invading army was defeated by forces led by the Paekche crown prince. Shortly afterward, another Koguryo attack was repelled, and Paekche launched its own offensive that struck deep into enemy territory. In a dramatic battle near Pyongyang, the king of Koguryo was killed. Despite this victory, the threat from the north remained serious. Paekche strengthened its defences and relocated important administrative centres to more secure positions. Warfare between the two kingdoms continued intermittently for decades. At times, Paekche achieved impressive successes, but the conflict never truly ended. Meanwhile, Paekche also sought stability through diplomacy with neighbouring Silla. Earlier traditions portray relations between the two kingdoms as frequently hostile. However, during the 4th century, their rivalry appears to have softened. Exchanges of gifts and embassies suggest the development of a cautious partnership. This cooperation likely reflected a shared concern about the growing power of Koguryo. Another important development during this era was the gradual spread of literacy and record-keeping. Early traditions suggest that written administration was not firmly established in Paekche until the reign of Geunchogo. A figure known as Ko Hung is credited with organising the recording of official events. His name suggests a Chinese background, and immigrants from former Chinese territories probably played a major role in introducing written culture to the kingdom. The presence of literate scholars from Paekche in Japan during the early 5th century provides further evidence of this cultural exchange. Japanese historical tradition remembers teachers from Paekche who introduced knowledge of Chinese writing and classical texts to the Yamato court. These individuals helped transmit the literary culture of the continent to Japan and demonstrate the intellectual connections linking the two regions. Religious developments also transformed Paekche society during this period. Buddhism arrived in the kingdom in the late 4th century, carried by a monk who had travelled from southern China. The Paekche king received the monk with great honour and soon ordered the construction of a temple. This event marked the beginning of Buddhism's presence at the royal court. Although surviving records provide only fragmentary information about the early spread of the religion, archaeological discoveries confirm its presence in the capital region by the early 5th century. Buddhist images and architectural elements decorated with lotus motifs indicate that the new faith was already influencing artistic expression. At first, however, Buddhism appears to have remained largely confined to the court and aristocracy. The religion likely spread gradually because literacy was still limited among the population. Understanding Buddhist scriptures required familiarity with written Chinese, a skill possessed mainly by foreign scholars and members of the elite. For many early supporters, the appeal of Buddhism probably lay less in its complex philosophy than in its promise of protection, good fortune, and spiritual merit. Over time, Buddhism became deeply integrated into the cultural life of Paekche. Royal patronage encouraged the construction of temples and the training of monks. The faith also strengthened Paekche's cultural connections with China, and later played a significant role in transmitting continental traditions to Japan. Meanwhile, the geopolitical struggles of the region continued to shape the kingdom's fate. Under the powerful leadership of Koguryo's King Kwangaeto, the balance of power shifted dramatically in the early 5th century. Koguryo launched a series of campaigns that expanded its territory and weakened its rivals. Paekche suffered significant defeats during this period, and the political consequences were profound. In the aftermath of these conflicts, Paekche turned once again toward its alliance with the Yamato court. diplomatic ties with Japan intensified, and the relationship became an important factor in regional politics. Although Paekche maintained its independence, the tone of the surviving evidence suggests that the Yamato rulers often exercised considerable influence. The opening years of the 5th century represent the moment when the rulers of Yamato exercised their greatest influence on the Korean Peninsula. Inscriptions from the period describe a dramatic confrontation in the year 400, when the Koguryo king Kwangeto sent a massive army southward. The campaign is said to have driven Japanese forces out of Silla with relative ease. Despite the scale of this operation, its long-term impact appears limited. Japanese military activity in the region did not disappear, and the balance of power in southern Korea remained unsettled. Only 2 years later, Silla found itself under such pressure that it sent a royal prince to the Japanese court as a hostage. This gesture signaled a difficult political reality. Even after making this concession, Silla continued to clash with forces connected to the archipelago. Hostage diplomacy did not end the violence, and the struggle for influence across southern Korea continued. A few years afterward, Japanese troops launched a bold expedition against Koguryo itself. Moving by sea, they struck at territory that had once belonged to a Chinese commandery. The attack failed, and the invaders were decisively repelled. Even so, the event reveals how active and ambitious the military forces of the archipelago remained during this era. At the same time, Paekche maintained an unusual form of diplomatic relationship with Japan. During the early 5th century, the kingdom began sending skilled individuals to the Japanese court. These men were valued not as soldiers, but as bearers of culture and knowledge. Among them were literate scholars, familiar with Chinese learning, including figures remembered in Japanese tradition, for teaching writing and classical text to the ruling elite. Their presence reflects the close political and cultural connection linking the two courts. Events in 405 vividly illustrate the degree to which Paekche relied on support from the Japanese leadership during this period. When King Asin died, the rightful heir to the throne was not present in the capital. The crown prince had been living for years at the Japanese court as a hostage. Upon hearing of the king's death, the ruler of the archipelago provided the prince with an armed escort and sent him back to claim his throne. The situation in Paekche had already grown chaotic. One of the prince's brothers had seized power and eliminated a rival claimant. When the returning heir arrived, he faced not only a political struggle but also the threat of violence. In the end, it was the protection of the Japanese escort and the support of the population in the capital that allowed him to take his rightful place as king. His reign that followed became a period of particularly close relations between Paekche and the Japanese court, shaped by years of personal connection and political obligation. Yet even during the height of Japanese influence, the kingdoms of southern Korea never ceased to function as independent states. Japanese rulers claimed authority over several regions of the peninsula, and even sought recognition for these claims from Chinese emperors. In practice, however, Paekche and Silla continued to pursue their own diplomatic and political agendas. Silla, in particular, regarded the expanding power of Koguryo as its greatest concern. In the early 5th century, Silla sent one of its princes as a hostage to the northern kingdom, demonstrating how seriously it viewed the threat from that direction. The prince remained there for years, a sign of the uneasy balance between the states of the peninsula. Paekche likewise maintained its own independent connections with China. Diplomatic missions continued to cross the Yellow Sea, and Chinese emperors formally recognized Paekche's rulers with prestigious titles. Such recognition reinforced the legitimacy of the Paekche monarchy and helped counterbalance pressure from neighboring powers. At the same time, Paekche gradually moved to restore friendly relations with Silla. Earlier conflicts had damaged their relationship, but circumstances encouraged a renewed alliance. In the mid-5th century, Paekche sent envoys to Silla, seeking reconciliation. Soon afterward, the two kingdoms formalized their renewed friendship. This partnership would become an important element in resisting the expanding influence of Koguryo. Despite these diplomatic efforts, the historical record from the middle decades of the 5th century remains unusually sparse. Surviving narratives offer only scattered references to events between the mid-430s and the late 460s. Yet by placing these fragments within the broader political context, certain patterns become clear. Japanese influence in southern Korea gradually weakened, while pressure from Koguryo continued to intensify. This persistent northern threat encouraged closer cooperation between Paekche and Silla. Evidence from Silla's own historical tradition suggests that relations with Koguryo during this time were frequently tense. In one incident, a Silla commander ambushed and killed a Koguryo general who had been travelling through the region under the pretense of hunting. The king of Koguryo responded with anger, accusing Silla of betrayal and launching a retaliatory attack along its northern frontier. Although Silla eventually sought peace, hostilities between the two states did not disappear. Further conflicts followed in later years. Armies from Koguryo repeatedly struck Silla's borders, sometimes with the assistance of tribal allies from the north. At least once, Paekche itself came under attack, prompting Silla to send troops to assist in its defense. These moments reveal how the southern kingdoms increasingly cooperated in the face of a common threat. The pressure exerted by Koguryo was felt even more strongly within Paekche itself. The kingdom strengthened its frontier defences and occasionally launched raids across the border. At the same time, its rulers looked abroad for support. One dramatic example appears in a diplomatic appeal sent by the Paekche king to the Northern Wei dynasty in China. In this message, the king complained that decades of war with Koguryo had drained the kingdom's resources and exhausted its people. The appeal sought military assistance from China, but the request was denied. The Chinese court had little interest in becoming directly involved in the conflict. Without external support, Paekche remained vulnerable to the growing power of its northern rival. A dramatic story from Paekche tradition illustrates the dangers facing the kingdom at this time. According to the account, a Buddhist monk from Koguryo arrived in Paekche pretending to be a fugitive. Through his skill in the board game, Paduk, he gained the friendship of the Paekche king, who was fond of the game. Over time, the monk persuaded the king to undertake costly construction projects that drained the treasury and overworked the population. Once the kingdom had been weakened, the monk returned to Koguryo and reported the situation to his ruler. Soon afterward, a massive Koguryo army advanced toward the Paekche capital in the Han River Valley. The attack came in 475 and proved devastating. As the enemy approached, the Paekche king sent his son south to seek assistance from Silla. Although Silla dispatched a large relief force, it arrived too late. The capital had already fallen, and the king had been captured and executed after public humiliation. When the Silla troops finally reached the area, the Koguryo army withdrew. This allowed the surviving prince to claim the throne, but the kingdom had suffered a catastrophic blow. Within weeks, the new ruler decided to abandon the old capital and move the centre of government far to the south. The new location, surrounded by mountains, offered stronger natural defences and greater distance from the Koguryo frontier. The relocation proved necessary, as pressure from the north did not disappear. Koguryo and its allies continued to threaten Paekche's borders. In response, the kingdom increasingly turned its attention toward the southern and western regions of the peninsula, areas where Japanese influence had once been strong but was now fading. Tracing the decline of Japanese authority in southern Korea is difficult because the surviving records offer only scattered clues. Japanese chronicles provide limited information, and Korean sources mention few details about relations with the archipelago during the later 5th century. Nevertheless, the overall trend is clear. Silla gradually reduced the tribute it once sent to Japan, while Paekche maintained friendly but increasingly independent relations. Japanese rulers continued to receive occasional visitors from Paekche. Artisans, scholars, and even members of the royal family travelled to the archipelago and took positions at the Japanese court. Yet these exchanges were cultural rather than political. They reflected cooperation and prestige rather than dependence. The events surrounding the fall of Paekche's capital reveal just how far Japanese influence had declined. When the prince sought help in 475, he turned only to Silla. He did not attempt to call upon allies in the regions once associated with Japanese authority. This decision suggests that meaningful military assistance from the archipelago was no longer expected. Further evidence of this shift appeared soon afterward. A large island to the south of Korea sent tribute directly to Paekche for the first time. Not long after that, a ruler from the Kaya region dispatched his own embassy to China and was recognized there as an independent king. Such developments indicate that the political system once tied to Japanese influence was fragmenting. Chinese records also reflect this change. Earlier, Chinese titles granted to Japanese rulers had described them as military commanders with authority over large areas of southern Korea. By the early 6th century, those titles referred only to territories within Japan itself. At the same time, Chinese emperors continued to grant traditional honors to the kings of Paekche and Koguryo, acknowledging them as independent rulers. Throughout these turbulent decades, Paekche maintained steady diplomatic contact with China. Missions traveled regularly across the sea, bringing tribute and receiving recognition from successive dynasties. The consistency of these exchanges stands out, especially considering the wars and political upheavals taking place on the peninsula. One unusual episode occurred when the Paekche king attempted to persuade the Northern Wei dynasty to join an alliance against Koguryo. The plan called for simultaneous attacks from several directions. The Chinese emperor refused, advising peace instead and warning against aggression. With that decision, the scheme collapsed, leaving Paekche once again to face its powerful rival alone. Even after the loss of its capital, the kingdom continued to send embassies to China. In one instance, an envoy attempted to reach the Chinese court, but was blocked by military interference from Koguryo. Such incidents demonstrate how closely warfare and diplomacy were intertwined in this period. Archaeological discoveries from the former capital region offer another perspective on Paekche during these centuries. Excavations near modern Seoul have uncovered tombs and architectural remains that reflect the culture of the royal elite. Among the most striking are large stone burial mounds, constructed in a stepped pyramid form. These monuments resemble similar royal tombs, associated with Koguryo. The scale and design of these tombs suggest that they belonged to the highest levels of society, possibly even to members of the royal family. Their architectural style closely parallels that of major Koguryo burial sites in the north. This resemblance is striking given the intense military rivalry between the two kingdoms. Roof tiles discovered in the same region reveal similar cultural connections. Many are decorated with lotus motifs associated with Buddhist symbolism. The design style resembles patterns known from northern China and from Koguryo sites. This suggests that artistic and religious influences moved across political boundaries even during periods of conflict. A small bronze statue of the Buddha found near the ancient capital further illustrates this exchange. Its style points to northern Chinese origins and indicates that Buddhist imagery travelled through the networks linking Korea and the Chinese mainland. Koguryo likely served as an intermediary in transmitting these influences southward. These discoveries highlight an important historical reality. Political borders and military rivalries did not prevent the movement of ideas, artistic styles, and religious traditions. Even during times of war, the cultures of neighbouring societies remained interconnected. The fall of Hansong in 475 and the death of King Kairo marked the beginning of one of the most dangerous periods in the history of Paekche. When the northern kingdom of Koguryo captured the capital and executed the king, the political and military foundations of Paekche were shaken. The royal court abandoned its long-standing seat of power in the Han River Valley and moved southward to the fortified city of Ungjin. From that moment onward, the kingdom entered a period of instability characterized by external pressure, internal unrest, and repeated struggles for authority within the ruling elite. During the final decades of the 5th century, the situation remained precarious. Paekche's territory had been drastically reduced, and the loss of the Han River basin weakened both its strategic position and its economic base. Koguryo forces continued to threaten the northern frontier while the royal government struggled to maintain order among powerful aristocratic factions. Rebellions, assassinations, and succession disputes became recurring features of court politics. Yet the same period that brought these difficulties also forced the ruling elite to reorganize the political structure of the kingdom. The reforms that emerged from this crisis gradually restored stability and ultimately allowed Paekche to recover its strength. The first ruler to confront the aftermath of the disaster at Hansong was Munju. He had left the capital shortly before its fall in order to seek military assistance from Silla. By the time he returned, the city had already been overrun and the royal family had been captured or killed. As the senior surviving member of the ruling line with recognized authority, he assumed the throne and immediately relocated the government to Ungjin. The new capital lay farther south, protected by surrounding mountains and more easily defended against northern invasion. Soon afterward, the remaining population north of the Han River was ordered to move south as well. The decision reflected the continuing danger posed by Koguryo. Paekche's leaders understood that they could no longer maintain control over their former northern territories and chose instead to concentrate their remaining resources in the safer regions to the south. Munju attempted to strengthen the government by appointing influential aristocrats to key offices and by promoting members of the royal family to positions of authority. These measures were intended to stabilize the court and consolidate loyalty around the throne. Despite these efforts, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Rival factions within the aristocracy competed for power, and before long, the king himself fell victim to a conspiracy. An official who had risen to prominence during Munju's reign turned against him and arranged his assassination. After Munju's death, the throne passed to his son Samgun, who was still a child. Because of his youth, real authority fell into the hands of powerful ministers. One of these figures soon attempted to seize control of the kingdom. Together with allies from other aristocratic families, he organized a rebellion and took possession of a major fortress along the northern frontier. The royal court eventually suppressed the uprising, but the struggle revealed how fragile the central government had become. Even after the rebellion was crushed, the kingdom faced further misfortune. A severe drought struck the land, bringing widespread hardship to the population. In the midst of these troubles, the young king died unexpectedly, leaving no heir to succeed him. the throne then passed to a relative from another branch of the royal family, a man who later became known as King Tongzong. Tongzong's accession did not bring immediate stability. According to Japanese historical tradition, he had been living in the archipelago at the time of the previous king's death and returned to Paekche with a contingent of soldiers provided by the Yamato court. If this account is accurate, it suggests that Paekche's rulers still relied on their long-standing connections with Japan during moments of political crisis. The new king soon found himself confronting the same threats that had troubled his predecessors. Koguryo forces continued to attack along the northern frontier, sometimes in cooperation with groups from the northern steppe. At the same time, Paekche sought to maintain an alliance with Silla, since both kingdoms faced the common danger posed by their northern rival. Military cooperation between the two southern states became an important feature of the period. On several occasions, Paekche armies marched to aid Silla against invading forces, and at other times, Silla sent troops to support Paekche in defending its territory. Diplomatic ties between the two courts were strengthened when a woman of Silla's royal family was married into the Paekche dynasty. Despite these efforts at cooperation abroad, the internal situation within Paekche grew increasingly unstable. The historical record portrays the later years of Tongzong's reign as a time of social distress and political disorder. Reports describe floods, droughts, and crop failures that afflicted the country over many successive years. Such accounts may partly reflect the moral judgments of later historians, who often interpreted natural disasters as signs that a ruler had lost the mandate to govern. Narratives about the king's behaviour during this period depict him as neglecting the welfare of his subjects. He is described as devoting excessive attention to personal pleasures, while ignoring the suffering caused by famine and heavy labour obligations. In this portrayal, the ruler refuses advice from loyal officials and isolates himself from criticism. Eventually, one of his own ministers organised a plot that led to the king's assassination. After Tongzong's death, the throne passed to a new ruler remembered as King Muriong. His reign marked the beginning of Paekche's gradual recovery from decades of crisis. The first challenge he faced was a rebellion led by the very official responsible for the previous king's death. The revolt was quickly crushed and the rebel leader was executed. This decisive action helped restore authority to the monarchy. Although internal order improved, the external threats facing Paekche did not disappear. Koguryo continued to send raiding forces across the northern frontier, sometimes capturing prisoners and plundering border settlements. In response, Muriong personally led several military campaigns to repel these incursions. The kingdom also carried out retaliatory raids against enemy strongholds, demonstrating that it had regained some of its military capacity. During this period, Paekche renewed diplomatic relations with the southern Chinese dynasties. Embassies travelled across the sea, bearing tribute and messages from the king. These missions were part of the wider system of international relations that connected East Asian states to the Chinese imperial court. Recognition from the Chinese emperor reinforced the prestige of Paekche's rulers and affirmed their status among neighbouring powers. Evidence from Chinese historical records suggests that the kingdom gradually regained strength during Muriong's reign. After years of decline, Paekche once again appeared as a stable and active state in regional diplomacy. Military successes against Koguryo further improved its position. The death of Muriong in 523 brought his son Song to the throne. His reign represents another major turning point in Paekche history. Contemporary accounts describe him as an energetic and capable ruler who combined learning with military ability. Under his leadership, the kingdom experienced renewed prosperity and political confidence. One of the most significant decisions of Song's reign was the relocation of the capital in 538. Although Ungjin had served as a secure refuge during the period of crisis, its mountainous surroundings limited communication and economic development. Once Paekche had regained stability, the location was no longer ideal for a growing state. The court therefore moved to Sabi, a city situated farther south near the lower course of the Coombe River. The region was fertile and closer to major maritime routes, linking the peninsula with China. The new capital also allowed easier access to agricultural resources and trade networks along the Yellow Sea. For more than a century, until the fall of the kingdom, Sabi would remain the center of Paekche's government. The relocation of the capital symbolized more than a geographic shift. It reflected the confidence of the ruling elite that the kingdom had recovered from its earlier disasters. At the same time, the government undertook reforms that strengthened central authority and reorganized the administration along models inspired by Chinese political traditions. Relations with neighboring states continued to shape Paekche's fortunes. Hostilities with Goguryeo remained a constant concern, although large-scale battles occurred less frequently during the early years of Song's reign. Paekche's improved military capacity helped discourage major invasions from the north. The alliance with Silla, however, gradually weakened. Both kingdoms sought to expand their influence into the territories of the Kaya Confederation, located between them. As each state attempted to absorb parts of this region, tensions increased. Although diplomatic exchanges between the two courts continued, competition over land and strategic resources steadily eroded the earlier partnership. At the same time, Paekche strengthened its ties with China through regular diplomatic missions. Envoys requested cultural materials, skilled artisans, and religious texts. These exchanges helped transmit continental knowledge and artistic traditions into the kingdom. Among the cultural developments encouraged by the court was the growing patronage of Buddhism. The religion had been introduced earlier, but during the 6th century it received increasing support from the monarchy. Temples were constructed, monks were patronized, and Buddhist ideas became more closely associated with royal authority. While Paekche cultivated diplomatic and cultural connections abroad, political developments on the Korean Peninsula continued to evolve. Silla expanded its territory into former Kaya lands and eventually gained control of regions that had once belonged to Paekche itself. These actions deepened the rivalry between the two kingdoms. The turning point came when Silla seized strategic areas along the Han River Valley that Paekche had briefly regained during its campaigns against Goguryeo. The capture of this region gave Silla direct access to the Yellow Sea and significantly strengthened its international position. The betrayal deeply angered the Paekche court. In 554, King Song personally led a large army in an attempt to retaliate against Silla. The campaign ended in disaster. Silla forces ambushed the advancing troops, inflicting heavy casualties. The king himself was killed during the encounter, bringing a dramatic end to one of the most ambitious reigns in Paekche's history. Despite this defeat, the transformations that occurred between the late 5th and mid-6th centuries left a lasting legacy. Out of a period of crisis and near collapse, Paekche had rebuilt its political institutions, strengthened royal authority, and revived its cultural and diplomatic connections across East Asia. These changes laid the foundations for the kingdom's later achievements, even as the shifting balance of power on the peninsula continued to shape its fate. In the early 6th century, the Kingdom of Paekche began to strengthen the connection between royal authority and the Buddhist religion. One of the clearest signs of this change appears in records describing the construction of a great monastery in the capital at Ungjin during the early years of King Song's rule. This temple, known as Taitongsa, stood at the heart of the city and was built on a scale that made it one of the most impressive religious institutions of its time. Its foundation was not only a spiritual act, but also a political statement. The temple honored the famous Chinese emperor of the Liang dynasty, a ruler celebrated across East Asia for his devotion to Buddhism. By associating his own kingdom with this admired figure, the Paekche king presented himself as a participant in a broader world of Buddhist civilization that extended far beyond the Korean Peninsula. The location and design of the monastery reveal how carefully this project was planned. The temple complex occupied a large rectangular area laid out according to the 4 cardinal directions. Visitors entered through a main gate in the southern wall and moved northward through a sequence of sacred buildings aligned along a central axis. Inside the compound stood 3 principal structures that formed the spiritual center of the complex. The first was the pagoda, a tall monument that symbolized the presence of the Buddha's teaching. Behind it stood the icon hall, where statues of the Buddha and his divine attendants were displayed. Farther north was the lecture hall, a space used for teaching and religious discussion. This orderly arrangement was inspired by architectural traditions that had developed earlier in China and later spread throughout East Asia. Such a design was not chosen only for aesthetic reasons. The spatial arrangement of the monastery reflected a deeper set of ideas about order and hierarchy. In Buddhist thought, the universe was imagined as a structured and harmonious system centered on the ultimate truth of the Dharma. The layout of the temple mirrored this cosmic vision. The pagoda and icon hall, standing prominently within the compound, represented different expressions of the same sacred reality. The pagoda symbolized the timeless and invisible truth of the Buddha's teaching, while the icon hall displayed that truth in the form of sacred images. The carefully planned alignment of these buildings made the religious message visible and understandable even without explanation. This visual symbolism also carried political meaning. The ordered layout of the monastery echoed the centralized structure that Paekche's rulers were attempting to strengthen within their own government. Just as the temple presented a universe organized around a sacred center, the kingdom itself was meant to revolve around the authority of the throne. By sponsoring such a grand religious complex, the royal court displayed both its wealth and its ideological vision. The monastery became a powerful symbol of a kingdom guided by sacred principles and led by a ruler who stood at the center of both political and spiritual life. Evidence from this period also shows that Buddhism was becoming increasingly important in Paekche's relations with other countries. One early example concerns a monk named Pao Chong, who travelled from Paekche to southern China in search of religious learning. His journey is among the earliest known cases of a Korean monk studying abroad and returning home with new knowledge. Although few details survive about his experiences, it is very likely that his travels took place with royal approval. In many early East Asian states, religious scholars did not travel freely across borders without the support of their rulers. Pao Chong's journey therefore suggests that the Paekche court was already encouraging the study of Buddhism beyond its own borders. Connections between religion and diplomacy appear even more clearly in Paekche's interactions with the Japanese archipelago. Historical traditions describe how the Paekche king ordered the creation of a large statue of the Buddha and dedicated the religious merit of this act to the Japanese ruler and his lands. This gesture took place before Buddhism was formally introduced to the Japanese court, and may have been intended as a sign of goodwill and cooperation between the two states. The same record also describes a diplomatic mission sent to leaders in the Kaya region, carrying gifts from southern China and strengthening political alliances. One striking detail from these accounts concerns the leader of that mission. His name appears to be derived from the Sanskrit word associated with enlightenment, which raises the possibility that he was himself a Buddhist monk. If this interpretation is correct, it may represent one of the earliest known examples of Buddhist clerics serving directly within the political administration of Paekche. Later, history shows that monks often played important roles as diplomats, scholars, and advisors, and the early 6th century may mark the beginning of this development. The introduction of Buddhism to Japan was closely connected to these diplomatic activities. Although the exact date of the event has long been debated, there is little doubt that Paekche played a central role in bringing the religion to the Japanese court. The timing of this mission suggests that political considerations were just as important as religious ones. At that moment, Paekche faced growing pressure from neighbouring states on the Korean Peninsula and needed strong allies abroad. Sharing religious knowledge and sacred objects with Japan strengthened the cultural bond between the two courts and encouraged cooperation. Further evidence of the close relationship between religion and diplomacy appears in records describing exchanges of hostages between Paekche and Japan. These hostages were not only political figures, but also scholars and monks. The presence of Buddhist clerics among them shows how respected religious specialists had become within Paekche society. Their participation in diplomatic exchanges also demonstrates how closely the Buddhist community was connected to the royal government. Paekche's rulers also used Buddhism to strengthen their ties with China. Diplomatic missions sent to the Liang dynasty sometimes included requests for Buddhist texts and learned commentaries. These requests were carefully chosen. The Chinese emperor was famous for his devotion to Buddhism and had personally written interpretations of important religious scriptures. By asking for such works, the Paekche king showed respect for Chinese learning while also reinforcing the religious policies he was promoting within his own kingdom. These diplomatic gestures also reflected deeper cultural changes taking place within Paekche itself. After the capital was moved to the city of Sabi, the royal court began building new palaces and temples influenced by Chinese architectural styles. Skilled artisans from the mainland were invited to assist in these projects, ensuring that the new buildings reflected the most prestigious artistic traditions of the time. Through such efforts, the Paekche monarchy aligned itself with the cultural authority of China while strengthening its own position at home. Archaeological discoveries provide further insight into this transformation. The royal tomb of King Muryeong offers one of the clearest examples. This burial chamber was discovered in the 20th century and remains the only intact royal tomb from Paekche that has been fully examined. The structure reveals a remarkable blend of local traditions and Chinese influences. Built from carefully arranged bricks and aligned along a north-south axis, the tomb resembles burial chambers, constructed in southern China during the same period. The interior of the tomb also contains decorative elements that highlight the growing importance of Buddhism. Many of the bricks used in the walls are decorated with lotus flower designs. In Buddhist symbolism, the lotus represents purity and spiritual awakening, rising clean and beautiful from muddy water. The repeated use of this motif inside the tomb suggests that the designers wished to associate the king's burial with Buddhist ideas of enlightenment and rebirth. Other features of the tomb reinforce this interpretation. Special niches built into the walls were designed to hold lamps that illuminated the chamber during rituals. Their shape resembles the sacred jewel often associated with Buddhist imagery, and traces of painted decoration indicate that they once glowed with symbolic meaning. Together, these elements reveal that the tomb was carefully planned, not only as a resting place for the king, but also as a monument expressing the religious values of the royal court. The artistic style of the tomb and its decorations also shows strong connections to southern China. Similar lotus designs appear on roof tiles and bricks used in contemporary Chinese buildings. The adoption of these motifs demonstrates how closely Paekche's elite culture followed artistic developments beyond the peninsula. This pattern of cultural exchange extended beyond architecture into sculpture as well. Although few surviving Buddhist statues from the capital at Ungjin have been found, several sculptures discovered at temple sites in later Paekche cities display clear influences from Chinese artistic traditions. A small-seated Buddha carved from stone and a gilded bronze figure of a bodhisattva both show stylistic features associated with the Liang dynasty. These works reveal that Paekche artists were actively adapting foreign models while developing their own distinctive style. Taken together, these architectural, artistic, and historical sources reveal a kingdom undergoing significant transformation. The early 6th century was a time when Paekche's rulers deliberately reshaped their political and cultural identity. Buddhism played a central role in this process. Through temples, diplomatic exchanges, religious learning, and artistic production, the royal court used the religion to strengthen its authority and to connect the kingdom with the wider world of East Asian civilization. The reigns of Kings Muryeong and Song in the early 6th century marked a decisive turning point in the history of Paekche. During these decades, the kingdom underwent profound political and cultural transformation. Institutions were reorganized, state authority strengthened, and new cultural models from the continent were adopted with unusual enthusiasm. These changes reshaped Paekche into the most thoroughly Sinicized state among the kingdoms of northeastern Asia. Over time, this cultural orientation allowed Paekche to act as an important transmitter of continental ideas, technologies, and religious traditions to neighboring societies, particularly Silla and the emerging state in the Japanese archipelago. Just as importantly, the reforms of this period restored Paekche's internal strength after earlier setbacks, allowing the kingdom to re-emerge as an active military power on the Korean Peninsula even after the death of King Song in battle. Surprisingly little information survives about the later 6th century, despite the fact that the dynasty had already existed for many centuries. The historical record for the reigns of King Wheatok, King Hai, and King Pop is noticeably sparse. Although Wheatok ruled for more than 4 decades during a period of important change both within Korea and across China, most surviving accounts of his reign consist of fragments borrowed from Chinese chronicles. The small number of remaining entries often describe events involving Silla and appear to rely heavily on Silla's own records. Another notable feature of the surviving material is the frequent mention of unusual celestial events, such as eclipses and comets. Many of these reports clearly originated in Chinese sources, while others may have been later inventions. Taken together, the record offers only limited insight into the internal history of Paekche during this era. Wheatok, whose personal name was Chaang, was the eldest son of King Song. He assumed leadership shortly after his father was killed during the disastrous campaign against Silla in the year 554. Some accounts suggest that he formally accepted the throne several years later, possibly because he observed an extended period of mourning. One tradition describes a dramatic moment early in this interval when the prince announced that he intended to abandon political life and become a Buddhist monk in honor of his father's memory. Court officials reportedly persuaded him to remain on the throne, arguing that the kingdom urgently required stable leadership. Instead of entering the monastic order himself, the prince arranged for a large number of people to take religious vows and provided generous donations to temples throughout the kingdom. Whether literal or symbolic, this story reflects the growing prestige of Buddhism within the royal court. Throughout the early years of Wheatok's authority, Paekche faced a difficult geopolitical situation. Relations with both Silla and Goguryeo were hostile, and the kingdom found itself surrounded by rivals. Shortly after Song's death, Paekche forces launched retaliatory attacks against Silla fortifications and carried off numerous captives. At roughly the same time, Goguryeo reportedly attempted to strike the former Paekche capital of Ungjin, although the attack was repelled. Later, traditions even describe a joint operation involving Japanese forces that targeted Goguryeo territory. Whether exaggerated or not, such stories reflect the unstable and frequently violent environment of the period. Military tension with Silla intensified as the decade progressed. In the early 560s, Paekche launched a raid along Silla's western frontier, but the invading force was intercepted and defeated. Soon afterward, Silla absorbed the remaining territories of the Kaya Confederation. This development dramatically altered the balance of power on the peninsula. With Kaya gone, Paekche now faced Silla along the entirety of its land borders. From that point onward, the rivalry between the two kingdoms hardened into a sustained struggle that would continue for generations. Chinese sources written centuries later preserved explanations for how this hostility emerged. They describe a time when Silla had once been subordinate to Paekche and relied upon it for protection. When Paekche began regaining strength and pressing against Goguryeo, Silla initially cooperated in military operations. Eventually, however, Silla seized strategic territory along the Han River while Paekche was preoccupied elsewhere. The betrayal poisoned relations between the two kingdoms. Hostilities intensified further after King Song was killed during the ensuing conflict. From that moment forward, warfare between Paekche and Silla became a recurring feature of peninsular politics. Widok continued to launch campaigns against Silla throughout his long reign, although the results were mixed. Several raids ended in defeat, while others caused damage along the frontier but produced little lasting change. At the same time, Paekche was occasionally threatened by Goguryeo forces from the north. The historical record for these years is fragmentary, yet it suggests that no single power held clear dominance. Each kingdom probed the defences of the others, while attempting to consolidate its own territory. Diplomatic relations with Japan also evolved during Widok's reign. Earlier communications between the two courts had frequently focused on military cooperation against Silla. After Silla's annexation of Kaya, however, the tone of these exchanges gradually shifted. Instead of requesting direct military assistance, Paekche increasingly supplied religious specialists, artisans, and technical experts who were essential for the establishment of Buddhism in Japan. Monks, sculptors, architects, and temple builders travelled across the sea, helping to construct religious institutions and transmit new forms of artistic expression. This cultural exchange coincided with major political developments in Japan. The Japanese leadership was beginning to reorganize its government along more centralized lines and sought inspiration from continental models of administration, religion, and scholarship. While China provided the theoretical framework for many of these reforms, Paekche offered practical examples that were geographically and culturally closer. As a result, Paekche played an especially influential role in shaping early Japanese Buddhist institutions. The spread of Buddhism within Japan was not universally accepted at first. Rival aristocratic factions debated whether the foreign religion should be officially permitted. Despite the controversy, Paekche continued to send monks, scriptures, and sacred objects. These actions were deliberate and calculated. By supporting the Buddhist faction within the Japanese court, Paekche strengthened ties with an important overseas ally, while simultaneously promoting a religious tradition that had become closely linked to royal authority within its own borders. In addition to religious teachers, Paekche also allowed Japanese novices to travel to the peninsula for monastic training. In the late 6th century, several young women who had recently taken vows in Japan journeyed to Paekche in order to study the discipline and rules governing Buddhist monastic life. Their training there marked the earliest recorded example of Japanese nuns receiving formal religious education abroad. After completing their studies, they returned home and helped establish the foundations of the Japanese monastic community. Diplomatic relations with China also resumed during Widok's reign after a long interruption. Earlier, political turmoil on the peninsula had limited contact with the Chinese courts. Beginning in the late 6th century, however, Paekche once again sent tribute missions to several Chinese regimes. These embassies carried gifts, musicians, and letters affirming friendship and loyalty. Chinese rulers responded by granting honorific titles to the Paekche king and recognizing his authority. Such diplomatic gestures served practical purposes. Recognition from powerful Chinese dynasties enhanced the prestige of Paekche's monarchy and reinforced its status within the broader East Asian political order. At the same time, the exchanges facilitated cultural transmission. Scholars, monks, and artisans traveling between the two regions carried new ideas in religion, philosophy, architecture, and artistic technique. Buddhist learning flourished during this period. One monk from Paekche travelled to southern China to study meditation practices under a renowned master. After mastering these teachings, he returned to the peninsula and established himself as a respected teacher whose secluded retreat attracted numerous disciples. His story demonstrates that Buddhism in Paekche was not limited to court patronage, but also supported vibrant intellectual and spiritual communities. Widok was succeeded briefly by his brother, who ruled for only a short time before dying. The throne then passed to his nephew, remembered as King Pop. Although his reign lasted less than 2 years, he is remembered for his deep devotion to Buddhism. One of his first acts as ruler was to issue a decree discouraging the killing of animals throughout the kingdom. Hunting equipment was destroyed and falcons used for sport were released. While such measures were largely symbolic, they reflected the ethical ideals associated with Buddhist teachings on compassion and nonviolence. Pop also initiated construction of a large temple near the royal capital. This monastery would later become one of the most important religious centres in the kingdom. Work continued for decades, long after the king himself had died. Even before its completion, monks were installed there and ceremonies were held within its unfinished halls. When drought struck the region, the king personally visited another temple to pray for rain, demonstrating how closely religious practice had become linked with royal responsibility. A new era began with the accession of King Mu at the start of the 7th century. The surviving records from his reign are far more detailed than those of the preceding decades. They describe a period of renewed strength in which Paekche regained confidence and resumed active military campaigns. The kingdom's armies launched frequent attacks against Silla, gradually recovering territory along the frontier. At the same time, relations with Goguryeo slowly improved, eventually leading to a cautious alignment against their common rival. Early campaigns during Mu's reign met with mixed results. Several assaults on Silla fortresses failed, and large armies sometimes suffered heavy losses. Gradually, however, Paekche achieved more success. Strategic strongholds were captured and border regions brought under renewed pressure. These victories alarmed Silla and forced it to seek diplomatic support from powerful neighbours. During this period, Chinese rulers once again took a direct interest in the political affairs of the peninsula. Paekche attempted to encourage Chinese military expeditions against Goguryeo, hoping to weaken one rival while focusing its own forces on Silla. At times, Paekche offered intelligence or logistical support to Chinese campaigns. The true intentions behind these maneuvers remain uncertain, yet they demonstrate the complex diplomacy of the era. Even as warfare continued, Paekche maintained cordial relations with Japan. Diplomatic missions were exchanged regularly, and cultural exchange remained active. Monks, scholars, craftsmen, and musicians travelled from Paekche to the Japanese islands, where their knowledge helped shape the emerging institutions of the Japanese state. In return, Japanese rulers maintained friendly ties with Paekche and remained attentive to developments on the peninsula. Within Paekche itself, Buddhism continued to flourish under royal patronage. Monasteries were constructed not only in the capital but also in rural regions. Temples became centers of learning, ritual, and artistic production. Sculptors created images of the Buddha influenced by styles from both southern and northern China. As diplomatic contact with various Chinese dynasties expanded, these artistic styles evolved and blended into distinctive local forms. One of the most impressive monuments of this period was the great temple complex known as Miruksa. Built near the modern city of Iksan, the monastery was extraordinary in both scale and design. Instead of a single central pagoda and hall, the complex contained 3 parallel sanctuaries aligned within one enormous enclosure. Each sanctuary included its own pagoda and main hall, creating a vast ceremonial space unlike any other temple of its time. This unusual arrangement reflected religious ideas associated with the future Buddha Maitreya. According to Buddhist belief, Maitreya would appear in a distant age to teach the Dharma in a series of great assemblies. The 3 sanctuaries symbolize these future gatherings and express the hope that Paekche would become the land where this cosmic event might one day occur. By sponsoring such an ambitious project, King Mu connected his own rule with a vision of universal renewal and divine kingship. Archaeological discoveries confirm the grandeur of the site. The temple grounds extended over a vast area, with monumental gates, pagodas, lecture halls, and residential quarters arranged according to carefully planned axes. The scale of construction suggests strong royal backing as well as the participation of skilled craftsmen drawn from across the kingdom and beyond. Other temples and palaces built during Mu's reign reveal a court culture that combined religious devotion with displays of royal prestige. Artificial lakes were created near the capital, gardens were designed in elaborate continental styles, and pavilions overlooking the river served as settings for court gatherings. Such projects demonstrate the resources available to the monarchy and the sophisticated aesthetic tastes of the elite. Despite occasional criticism from later historians, these activities were not unusual for rulers of the time. Contemporary accounts indicate that Mu remained respected among neighbouring states. When news of his death reached the Chinese court, the emperor expressed formal mourning and bestowed honorary titles upon him. King Mu of Paekche died in the 3rd lunar month of the year 641. After his death, the throne passed to his eldest son, Uija, who had already been named Crown Prince nearly a decade earlier. His accession did not begin peacefully. Early accounts suggest that the first year of his rule was filled with political tension and instability. His mother, the queen of the late king, died soon after he came to power, and conflicts inside the royal court quickly followed. Several members of the royal family and dozens of aristocrats and officials were reportedly expelled from the court. These events reveal that Uija's early reign was marked by struggles over authority and the consolidation of power. By the following year, however, the new king appeared eager to demonstrate stability and legitimacy. He issued a general amnesty across the kingdom and travelled through the countryside to offer relief and reassurance to the people. Such tours were traditional gestures used by rulers to strengthen their connection with the population. But in this case, they likely also served a political purpose. After the unrest of his first months in power, the journey through rural districts allowed Uija to present himself as a benevolent and confident ruler who had firmly secured the throne. Not long after this tour, Paekche launched a powerful military campaign against its rival kingdom, Silla. The king personally led the campaign, and it proved extremely successful. Paekche forces reportedly captured more than 40 Silla fortresses, gaining control of the territories those fortifications protected. Although the sources only name one of these strongholds, the scale of the victories indicates a major shift in the balance of power on the Korean Peninsula. Later that same year, Paekche troops captured Taya Fortress, one of Silla's most important defensive positions. The location of this fortress shows that Paekche's expansion was concentrated in the southwest of Silla, rather than in the northern Han River region. The military pressure against Silla intensified rapidly during the early years of Uija's reign. In 643, Paekche strengthened its alliance with the northern kingdom of Goguryeo. Together, the two states planned a joint offensive against Tanghang Fortress, a strategic Silla stronghold that controlled access to the Yellow Sea and served as an important link between Silla and China. Armies from both kingdoms moved toward the fortress at the same time. The plan, however, collapsed when news arrived that Queen Sondok of Silla had urgently appealed to the Chinese imperial court for assistance. Silla soon attempted to recover lost ground. In 644, the famous Silla general Kim Yusin launched a campaign against Paekche and succeeded in retaking 7 fortresses. Yet the struggle remained balanced. The following year, Paekche forces captured a similar number of Silla strongholds. These victories were partly possible because Silla had committed many of its troops to assist Chinese military operations against Goguryeo. Paekche took advantage of this distraction and continued its advance. Despite occasional counterattacks, Silla found it difficult to stop the momentum of Paekche's military campaigns. Paekche armies captured additional fortresses in the late 640s, gradually expanding their control over frontier territories. By the middle of the century, the kingdom had become the dominant military power in the southern part of the peninsula. This success greatly strengthened Uija's confidence and shaped his increasingly bold political strategy. In 651, the Chinese emperor sent a message to the Paekche king after Silla had complained about the loss of its fortifications. The emperor urged Uija to restore the seized territories and maintain peace with his neighbour. The warning was stern, but it had little lasting effect. Although Paekche temporarily reduced its attacks, warfare soon resumed. In 655, Paekche joined forces with Goguryeo and northern tribes in a major campaign that captured more than 30 Silla fortresses. The alliance demonstrated that Paekche was now willing to challenge Silla with overwhelming force. Silla fought back whenever it could. In some battles, its armies managed to defeat invading Paekche troops and inflict heavy casualties. Yet the overall pattern of the conflict still favoured Paekche. Even when Silla repelled attacks, the victories were often defensive rather than decisive. By the late 600s and 50s, the frontier remained unstable, and both kingdoms continued to prepare for further war. While these military struggles unfolded, historical sources began to describe a dramatic change in the character of King Uija. Early in his reign, he was portrayed as a determined and capable ruler, praised for his sense of duty and his respect for his parents. He was even compared to famous models of filial devotion from classical tradition. His early actions, including public tours and generous amnesties, reinforced the image of a responsible monarch concerned for the welfare of his people. Later descriptions, however, paint a very different picture. Chronicles from the final years of the kingdom accuse the king of falling into luxury and excess. The palace of the crown prince was lavishly renovated, and new pleasure pavilions were constructed near the royal residence. The court became increasingly associated with extravagant celebrations, drinking, and indulgence. At one point, an official who criticized the king's behavior was imprisoned and left to die. Before his death, he reportedly warned the king about the dangers facing the kingdom and offered advice on how to defend it from future invasion. According to the story, Uija later regretted ignoring this counsel. Other reports from the same period claim that the king distributed high ranks and large estates to many of his sons born to concubines. Such acts were interpreted by later writers as signs of growing disorder within the royal household. Whether these accounts fully reflect historical reality or were influenced by later moral judgments remains uncertain. Nevertheless, they contributed to the traditional image of a ruler whose discipline weakened in the final years of his reign. At the same time, strange and unsettling events were said to occur throughout the kingdom. Chronicles describe unusual natural phenomena that were interpreted as ominous signs. Wells were said to turn red, vast numbers of toads gathered in unexpected places, and strange animals appeared within temple grounds. One particularly unusual story tells of a horse that entered a monastery and repeatedly walked around the sacred hall as if performing a ritual before collapsing and dying. Another tale describes monks who claimed to see a ghostly ship approaching their temple across an imaginary sea before vanishing. Such stories were often interpreted as warnings of approaching disaster. In many ancient societies, unusual natural events were believed to reflect the moral condition of the ruler and the stability of the state. Whether these incidents truly occurred or were later embellished, they reveal how people tried to understand the dramatic changes unfolding around them. Despite the turmoil described in these accounts, Paekche remained an important cultural center. Buddhism continued to flourish throughout the kingdom, supported by the royal court and the aristocracy. Temples and monasteries played a central role in religious life, education, and artistic production. Buddhist monks were highly respected figures, and many monasteries were closely connected to the royal household. One famous story from this period illustrates the reputation of Paekche's craftsmen and architects. The court of Silla wished to build a magnificent pagoda at a major monastery, but lacked the technical knowledge to construct such a large structure. Despite the political hostility between the two kingdoms, Silla sent gifts to Paekche and requested the assistance of a master builder. The Paekche king agreed and sent a skilled architect named Abiji. According to tradition, he oversaw the construction of a towering 9-story pagoda that became one of the most famous monuments in Silla for centuries. Religion also shaped broader cultural exchanges in East Asia during this period. While the northern kingdom of Goguryeo increasingly adopted Taoist traditions from China, Paekche remained strongly devoted to Buddhism. This difference attracted monks and scholars seeking a supportive environment for Buddhist practice. One such monk reportedly left Goguryeo because he disapproved of the growing influence of Taoism and chose to settle in Paekche instead, where he believed the Buddhist faith would be better protected. Paekche also maintained close diplomatic ties with Japan. Records from Japan mention frequent embassies exchanged between the two courts. These missions carried gifts, messages, and sometimes members of the royal family who lived abroad as political hostages. Such arrangements were common in ancient diplomacy and were intended to strengthen alliances and ensure trust between rulers. At the same time, Paekche's relationship with the Chinese Empire became increasingly strained. When Uija first became king, he received official recognition from the Chinese emperor and responded with respectful tribute missions. Over time, however, the situation changed. As Paekche expanded its power and continued to attack Silla, Chinese rulers grew more sympathetic towards Silla's complaints. Imperial messages warned Paekche to stop its aggression and restore captured territory. Uija largely ignored these warnings. Tribute missions became less frequent, and Paekche pursued its own strategic goals without regard for Chinese pressure. This independence reflected the kingdom's growing military confidence, but also deepened tensions with the powerful empire to the west. Eventually, the conflict reached a turning point. In 660, a massive military campaign was launched against Paekche. Chinese forces landed on the western coast, while Silla armies invaded from the east. The combined armies advanced rapidly toward the capital. After a series of disastrous strategic mistakes by Paekche's defenders, the capital city of Sabi fell. King Uija and the crown prince surrendered to the invading forces. The conquerors reorganized the kingdom's territory and carried thousands of captives to China, including the king himself and many leading officials. Although the emperor spared Uija's life, he wasn't allowed to return home and died in exile. The fall of the capital marked the end of Paekche as an independent kingdom, though resistance continued for several years as loyalists attempted to restore the dynasty.